So now that you've practiced values and shading, now we need to actually apply it. You guys are going to be using a basic light logic formula so that you have something to kind of go off a visual. So let me just explain this to you. This is basically what happens when light hits an object. So let's say our light source is here. It hits the number 1 is the highlight. So we have our highlight right here. Then 2 is a little bit darker, 3 is a little bit darker, and so on. Right here, our 5 is our darkest. That is also our core shadow. Interesting thing that happens is that right here, this is actually reflected light. It's slightly lighter. The darkest part, your darkest shadow, is usually not right on the edge. Every lighting situation is a little bit differently, but this actually, what happens is the light hits the tabletop, let's say here, and it kind of bounces back and reflects up. Notice right here, our cast shadow, that once again is the darkest. So the cast shadow and the core shadow should be the same amount of dark. This is what not to do. Can we start with the what not to do? Hopefully as you're listening to this and watching, hey, that was a pretty good circle on the first try. What did I do? I drew super, super dark. So now as I start shading this, if I start doing, you know, a lighter edge over here, you know, my 2, let's say, no matter what I do, I have that dark outline. This is gonna make things look flat. You don't wanna do that. The second thing you don't wanna do, remember in the last video, we talked about how value is careful observation of where the light and the shadow is, and it has to apply to the shape of the object. These lines, by the way, you wouldn't have these, it wouldn't look like a target, like a bullseye or stripes. It's a smooth rounding object, so you have to have smooth transitions, which is why you did your value scale. So these lines are just as guidelines, but you also notice that they're following the shape of the object. What some people do is they think, okay, here's my dark core shadow here. And you know what, if you do this, don't feel bad, because it's kind of a common beginner mistake. And this is not gonna look 3D because the shape of the object is curved. So we would need to make the corresponding shadows also curved. So this would be more like this as you're shading. No stripes, go with the shape. We've showed you what not to do. Go ahead, don't feel like you have to draw like super, super huge at the beginning. But if I'm starting with a light sketch, once again, the best way to get a circle is to kind of go around it a few times like that. If I'm trying to get this to look 3D, I do not want a dark outline. As you start, most people, it's kind of easier to start with a darker shadow, the darker part. Some of the harder shading is this light part right here. So sometimes it's like, eesh, if I start with that, is that too light, is that too dark? And it's kind of hard to tell. You can go either direction, you can go from light to dark, either way. But as I've seen in class, most people, it's easiest to start with their 6B pencil. This is going to be a little bit more in here with my core shadow. If you're unsure and you're like, I don't know if I'm doing this right or whatever, you know what? Your cast shadow, you don't even have to worry about it rounding. If you want to come in here, and here's an okay place to kind of outline it because this is actually an edge that you're going to see. So if you want to work on good shading technique down here and work on your darkest, darkest, darkest value, sometimes people feel a little bit more secure starting with this. So you notice I'm not doing this. I'm not pushing like a madman, but I am working on good, consistent shading so that I don't have any like gaps of white in between. And I would continue on with that. So if that's where you start, great. A lot of times what I also will do, I'm kind of comfortable shading in a certain direction. So don't feel like you have to, like, you know, turn your hand all around to get, you know, some of the stuff. If it works better to shade upside down, go ahead and shade upside down. So if I want to come in here and then start with that dark, but remember you can always come back and make it darker. I can use a little bit of that circle technique if I want to for the shading that we talked about. I can come in here and just use this, but I'm also keeping in mind that it's got a curve. So as I'm shading, I got to make sure I'm not doing that stripey thing. And there's kind of a starting point, and then you'll come back. I start easing up just a little bit. You notice I'm doing all this with my 6B pencil. I can barely touch the paper with my 6B pencil and get a really, really light area. Because we said this is going to be just a touch lighter. See that stripe in between? My reflected light, this is too light. my value scale we talked about the other day. The jump from this to this is a little too drastic. So I can come in here, add another layer. So remember, we can always add. It's a lot easier to come back in and darken something than to come in and erase it, because once you erase it, it changes the texture of your shading technique, and it's going to kind of smudge it. If at a later point I decide I need this to be a little bit darker in the core shadow, I can just come back in there and add that. So the building up of values is a really good technique. So you can see how I'm starting that. I'm still with my 6B pencil. At this point, I could switch to my 4B pencil. I could switch to a 2B pencil. Any of these is fine. You are personally gonna fall in love with different pencils, which ones you use more or not. One thing I like to do is have a scratch piece of paper off to the side. If you look at the point, I'm just using a Ticonderoga one. If you look at this point, it's kind of blunt and sharp. If I start with a sharp edge, I'm gonna get a little more liney thing. If I go to like where it was blunt, I'm gonna get a little bit of a better shading. So one thing that I do is I get the pencil into the right shape that I want. Does that make sense? Before I start, because right now I need to switch. I'm gonna now go to like a lighter value. Still using really light, really consistent shading. I can use the circle technique that we talked about before, or kind of go back and forth a little bit. I can do that, but once again, I'm doing a curved surface. Everybody's shading technique is gonna look slightly different, and any of this is fine. If this is what your shading technique looks like, great. If this is what it looks like, great. If this is what it looks like, then you still gotta work a little bit. So you can see how this is coming along. Okay, notice how I am curving my shading. It's another technique. Go ahead and try it. Lightest pencil. 2H pencil tends to be a little bit harder, so as I start working right here with that lighter pencil, I gotta really like barely touch the pencil to the paper. Are your objects going to be perfect the first time around? No. That's why we're gonna practice these. You're using the formula, you're gonna do some objects. You're gonna do 3 of them. When we look at this close up, it's still a little liney. I'm still gonna kind of rework it a little bit. But as you back up, see how we're getting that 3D effect. You can also see where it's uneven, because I kind of was showing you a couple of different techniques in the middle of it. So sometimes it happens as I demonstrate, and I kind of show you one thing and another, so you can actually see right about here. It almost looks like bumpy from farther away, right? It doesn't look smooth. So I need to smooth out some of these areas. Now you can see like what that effect is. When you look at it from a little bit farther away, then you can figure out where you need to go in and smooth things out. Is it perfect? No. Do I need to keep reworking it? Yes. But what you're gonna do is do something like this. You can kind of see in relation to my palm about how big it was. I can fit a couple of these on the same paper. You have to do one sphere and then pick 2 other objects. Cylinder is very similar because it's rounding. Cone, same thing, different shape, but it's rounding. So notice there still is a core shadow, reflected light. Then the one that's most unusual is the cube. If you want to try the cube, great. This is the core shadow here. This is the 5 cast shadow. So this is the 4, and this is the 3, 2, 2, 1. So this is the highlight part right here. So this one, there will be actual hard edges, because on here, as we're making things look round, we're transitioning. If you have the edge of a cube, then you're going to have your darkest shadow is going to be right here on the edge, because you got to kind of think that shadow and that highlight, they're coming up. You have more of an edge, right? One side of the box, one side of the box. So anytime you have a hard line like that, a hard transition like this, means a sharp edge, which is good for boxes, things like that, but not good for smooth objects. It's a little bit closer to being done. I went in and I did a little bit of that circle strategy of shading to kind of smooth out. A couple things to point out on this. One, where I used the Ticonderoga pencil. It still works. You can totally draw with a Ticonderoga. It was just a slightly different type of pencil lead. So I did have to kind of go back in and blend that because it was a little noticeable. One thing I forgot to warn you guys about. Okay, so can you see right here, this white line? That is there because, you know, I'm using a drawing pad. Right now, as I'm doing all this, so say, you know, how I said don't do this over here. guess what? Not only did I etch it on the other paper, but if I come in here and start shading, some of my marks from this one are on here. And I forgot to kind of warn you guys about that. If you have any of these like kind of ghost lines that show up on your shading, anything that you push down on really hard might get transferred to the next piece of paper. Because say over here where I really push down to do that outline, I can see it. It's like a, you know, coded message. Look at that, the outline, it's there. So another good reason to draw lightly. This one is much worse because it's much lighter weight paper, 60-pound paper. Most of the better weight drawing papers are closer to 90 pounds. A little more lesson on materials. Your project, 1 sphere and then 2 out of the 3, your choice, to try to make them good shading technique. So take your time and be a little patient with it. All right, see you next time.